Hi, the Pragmatic Luther back again. Today I want to show you some basic woodworking techniques involving using a jointer, using it safely, using it properly, and understanding what it can do, what it will do, and what it won't do. Before I get started, I guess some of the viewers may be wondering, where do I get this stuff? I mean, how do I know this, or what authority do I have to present it to anybody? So I mentioned in another video that I was a shop teacher for 33 years. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the State University of New York in industrial arts education. And I've been a woodworker all my life. Now, that's not to blow my horn. That's just to let you know that I don't pull this stuff out of the sky or figure because I got a jointer for Christmas last year that now I'm going to show everybody else how to use it. I actually do have some information and some background. I don't want to sound too basic or presuppose that everybody who views this is naive about these things, but in the event that some viewers maybe are thinking about buying a jointer or are really very, very basic with this stuff, I want to give you just a little bit of background about these things. This is an 8-inch jointer. A jointer's capacity is determined by the length of its knives. And of course, the width of the table goes along with that. So this happens to be an 8-inch jointer. And this one has, as you can see there at the pointer, this has straight knives. Many of them come with spiral cutter heads now, which probably are really a great idea. My planer has that, but this jointer's 20 years old, so it didn't come with that kind of an option at the time. At any rate, this is our in-feed table where material moves into the jointer. And of course, we would have the guard in place when we're doing that. This is the outfeed table. The outfeed table serves a tremendous purpose. This is what guides your material in a nice straight path. It's absolutely imperative. In fact, this should almost be longer than the in-feed table. Quite often they're equal, but you'd almost be better off with this being longer sometimes. You have a fence here. The fence is what keeps your material either at 90 degrees to the table or at whatever angle you happen to desire. Now, a good jointer will have an adjustable outfeed table as adjusted by this hand wheel. You can loosen the gibs here and make that move. I'm not going to do that because once you have this lined up, you don't want to touch it until it's time that you absolutely must. Over here is where you loosen the gibs to move the in-feed table, which I can do. Okay, we just went for a deeper cut there. I hope you could see that okay. And that's about all there is to it, really. This little ledge that's right here, this is called a rabbiting table. Now, I don't know if all jointers come with these anymore or not. You could use a jointer to cut rabbets, but with the advent of routers these days, it's rarely done. I don't think in the last 20 years since I've owned this, I probably haven't cut more than 2 rabbets on it. So that's about it. This, by the way, as you can see by this sort of triangular shape here on each side of the base, this is a dovetail jointer. In other words, the in-feed table and the outfeed table run on a set of machine dovetails to raise and lower them. And they are locked here by a set of gibs inside there. Some jointers operate on a series of parallelograms. I don't know that one is any better than the other. One is probably just as good as the other. So if you're buying, I don't think you really would need to be overly concerned about that. If you're buying a jointer, however, the question might become, what size jointer do you need? And that question is most easily answered by what you expect to do. If, for example, you're really a small project person, you know, making small objects, and you don't intend to joint long materials or wide materials, you could get by with a 4-inch jointer, but I would rather see anybody start with a 6-inch. That will allow you to dress material that's up to 6 inches in width. if you're going to do larger work, more furniture work, yeah, an 8-inch jointer would be better. And if you can do it, if you have the space in your shop, I recommend really that you start with an 8-inch jointer. I want to mention also what a jointer is not. This is not a planer, it's a jointer. I don't care how many ads you see on Facebook, in Marketplace, or Craigslist, or anywhere else. This is not a planer, and it's not a jointer planer. It's a jointer, that's all. And there's a reason that I'm emphasizing that. And that's because what a jointer does, because of it's really just an inverted hand plane with a motor on it. A jointer will flatten the surface of a board, and it will, after a surface is flat, it can guide that flat surface through the jointer and straighten an edge. And that's all a jointer is intended to do. It cannot make surfaces parallel. It cannot make edges parallel unless they already are. And even then, you're likely to suffer some loss if you're not careful. So, all we're going to do with the jointer, if we're using it properly, is we're going to flatten the surface of a board, and we're going to straighten the edge of a board that already has a flat surface. So the very first thing that we're going to do with a piece of lumber at the jointer is we're going to flatten the surface. Now you can see by that rocking of this piece of cherry that that's nowhere near flat. And quite often the edge won't be straight, and you'll even see some warpage, some bow, cupping, that sort of thing in the material. You want to take that out of it. Now it's important to know right now that when you joint a surface to make it flat, if there is a concave surface on the board, you want to put that down. As I press down here, you can see that there's space there. That's the concavity that I'm talking about. That wants to go down on the jointer table. It's very important. And you see this board is in wind. So to flatten this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. There's some technique involved here. What I'm going to do to flatten this is I'm going to let the jointer clip this corner as it goes in, and as soon as that's flat, I'll use that as a guide, and then we'll clip this corner second, and it'll eventually get it flat. If you just lay it down this way and run the material through there, all it's going to do is thin this edge, and by the time you get over here and get this all taken out and flat, this corner of the board over here, this edge, is likely to be, given this amount of warpage, I doubt you'd have a ½ inch in thickness left. So it's kind of a balancing act. But the first thing we always do is flatten the surface, and we want the concavity down on the table. So now, how do you get stuff through this thing? Well, there are several ways that I suppose this can be done. If you're working short material, you could use a homemade push block like this. This is just a flat piece of wood. I've glued a hook on it here, so to speak, to catch the end of the material so that it can push it through, and a good hefty handle on it. Now this is going to work beautifully, provided that you're not going to join anything much more than about 2 feet long. If you use this and you don't put down pressure out here on the front end of the material, it's just going to bounce and you're never going to get a flat surface. So you can use push blocks. I don't have a pair of them. I don't own any of them. You can buy them by different manufacturers, I suppose. There's yellow ones and there's beige ones or whatever, and they're real slick and exotic. And you're going to hear me say, if you watch more videos, you're going to hear me say slick and exotic, because I kind of like that term. And I'll admit that I'm using that in sort of a condescending manner. I'm not a big believer in buying gadgetry just because it's there, because a lot of times it's very good, but you have to weigh everything. Sometimes that stuff is not nearly as good as it's touted to be. So if you buy into any of that equipment, be careful. Still, you need to do this safely. So you either buy a set of push blocks that you can work with, that work for you. They need to be something that gets excellent traction on that material. or you make a block like this for doing short work. My particular method is these gloves that have this kind of crinkly finish, crepey rubber surface laminated to the palms and the fingers. Now, I use these because I like the control that I have with them. They get excellent grip on rough and even smooth lumber. They're inexpensive and you can change them out regularly if you need to. I work with these all the time. But it's important to remember, of course, we don't want our fingers down into that cutter head. So, when I pass material through the jointer, the first thing I do is I tend to close my hand. I don't spread it out. Never put your thumb or your fingers over the edge of the board. Never, ever, ever. And lastly, never hook your hand or your palm, excuse me, over that back end of that board. Don't ever do that. Your hand is on the surface where you can see it. I've repositioned the camera so that you can see a little more about what's going to happen here. The guard is out of position so that you can see. You are never, ever going to operate a jointer without that guard over it. There's no reason to. The guard is never going to be in your way except under one circumstance, which we'll get to. At any rate, let's look at what we're going to do here. We're going to move the material through the jointer, and I'm going to have my hand over it, and I'll film this in reality, in real time, so that you can see it. But I'm moving my hands over this, and I am keeping down pressure on this, and on a long board, I'm going hand over hand until the material is all the way through. Now, you can see and possibly even hear it dragging because it's catching on the knives. But you'll see this happen. I'll demonstrate this in real time. It's important to make this a good smooth action. And the longer your board is, the more important it is to keep one hand as best as you can, really just ahead of that cutter head. As soon as you get, say 6 or 7 inches across there, you want to keep that with your hands on the outfeed side, because that keeps that board down on that flat surface that's guiding the rest of the board through and allowing it to remain flat as it passes through. So I'm going to crank up the machine and show you that. Now you may have noticed that when I passed the material through the first time, it stuck right here. What happens is, since the board is warped, it literally dives a little bit down and catches on that outfeed table. And that's all right. If that happens, and it will happen to you from time to time, it's all right. Just back the material out and try another cut. You'll also notice that I skewed that a little bit to help it cut into that corner and then get it across the table. How deep do you cut? Well, I guess that depends on how much warpage you feel you want to remove in one pass. But remember, the deeper you cut, the harder you have to push, and the more dangerous things can become. When I taught in public schools, I restricted my students to no more than 1/16 of an inch depth of cut. Your jointer will probably cut a 1/2 inch, but you don't want to be in the same room when it's doing it. A 1/16 of an inch is a good place to start. Less than that, it can actually create some trouble really getting surfaces flat. But that's a place to start. More if you need to, but unless there is a rare circumstance, I'd never take more than 1/8 of an inch off of the surface or the edge of a board at one time. There's rarely a need to do so. So now let's look at edges. We can't joint the edge of a board until we have a flat surface, because the fence needs that flat surface to guide that board. Now we're going to have a 90-degree, can you see that? Now we're going to have a 90-degree angle here when that board is jointed. But if the board is warped, as you can see on the other side, there's no way that you can trust that. So we're going to join an edge. Important, if you have an edge of the board that is concaved, and this board is not in too bad shape. I could probably do either edge. But if you have a concave edge, it's best to put the concave edge down on the table. If the edge is convex, it'll be difficult because the board will rock back and forth. You may have trouble getting a good straight edge, and you may end up making multiple passes and still not get what you need. You can actually end up creating a taper. It's a mess. So concave edge down on the table. And I'm going to crank up the dust collector and the joiner, so it's going to get a little noisy in here, but here we go. By actually pulling the material, that is, by getting my hands over here and working on the outfeed side, it's also, a little bit safer because you're past the cutter head. But by doing that, again, we're guiding that board on that flat table, and as that edge is becoming increasingly long and straight, it guides nice and true through there. If I were to reach back and just push the board through and keep my hand pressure at the back end, I guarantee you're going to cut eventually just another convex edge. It can be very frustrating. So it's something to take into account. I learned that from a guy by the name of Bob Johnson. He was an official with Powermatic Machinery Company way back when they were still actually an American company in McMinnville, Tennessee. He made it very clear that you pull material through a joiner, you don't push it through. It makes very good sense. So, those are the basics in flattening a surface and straightening an edge. Now, what about the direction that you run your material through the joiner? Sometimes, if you can make that choice, it's a good idea. I'm going to exaggerate the concept of run out with this pencil. I can see in this piece of cherry that the run out goes in this direction. And you see I'm sloping through the thickness of the board. Let's see if that's visible. I hope it is. Since the knives rotate thusly as we look at the joiner, we want those knives to comb that lumber back into itself. It'll create a nice smooth cut. If we turn that around, you can even see right here, I'm tracing the run out in that. Well, it's going to comb it in the right direction there too, so we'd be okay. But sometimes, if you run against that, it'll tear the lumber. Sometimes the run out will end up being in both directions on the same board, and there's nothing you can do. You just got to go slow, make your cut nice and slow, even down pressure, do the best you can with it, and it'll turn out pretty well most of the time. The newer joiners with spiral cutter heads will eliminate a lot of that trouble, but not all of it. Keep that in mind. There's no silver bullet. Now, what about the minimum length of material? I suppose there's a lot of debate that could be had there, but I used to tell students, you never pass anything over a joiner that's under 12 inches long. If you have material that short or shorter, it can tend to rock when it hits that cutter head. And that can cause it to be thrown back at you or pushed back at you. And I've never had that happen to a student. It's never happened to me, fortunately. But you can just imagine if that were to fling out of your hands or push back quickly, you know, it's just a propensity for an injury, and it's never worth it. You just don't want to get hurt. So my recommendation is nothing under 12 inches long. You might go down to 8 inches if you've got a little 4-inch jointer, but still get good with a hand plane or get yourself a sander that'll take care of that. Anything. We don't want to get hurt. Now, what if a board is too wide for your jointer? Well, there are some remedies. You can, and here's that one circumstance where you may want to take the guard off the jointer. I'm not going to demonstrate this because I don't like to do it. But you could take a board that's too wide and you can make one pass, and you only get one pass because what doesn't get cut is still out here on that rabbiting table, and if you try to make a second cut, you're just going to create more and more of a wedge. It's not going to work well. That's why I don't really recommend this. But you could, in theory, run this board through the jointer and rotate it 180 degrees and run it again. The trouble with that, and the fallacy with that type of operation, is that if the board is warped, and this one is, you're not going to create the same flat surface in the same plane on both sides of the board. So all you're doing is chopping away wood, reducing thickness, but you're not really accomplishing anything. Well, what is the solution? There are a couple. If the board that you're jointing is, let's say, 8.5 or 9 inches wide, maybe even 10, depending on how you feel, you might be able to pass that through the jointer, one pass, and this is more successful, by the way, if the board is already reasonably flat, rough sawn, but reasonably flat. You could pass through one pass, take the board to your bench, and hand plane the remaining rough material off. You could do that. If the board is in pretty good shape in the first place, you might be able to turn it around and joint that remaining surface back off there. The trick is that you want to get it flat enough so that you can treat the opposite surface. That's what flattening on the jointer is all about, is getting ready to treat the opposite surface. Another way to accomplish this task, and this is a good example anyway, if I bring this board up where you can see it, this was cut out of a very small piece, and here's the pith heart right here. That lumber is useless. You're not going to do anything with that. So you take the smart way out. You run that right down through your bandsaw, or if you have a handheld jigsaw, you just strike a straight line and cut right down through that pith heart, eliminating that crack and making the board narrower. And then you join each one of those boards, and you can glue them back together, and you'd be surprised how nicely they'll glue back up if you keep edge to edge. That's another way you can do that. If you have thin material and or narrow material, it becomes dangerous to joint it. This is just a sample of cherry that is thin and it's rough on both surfaces, so something would need to be done if I were going to put this to use. But running this over a jointer becomes dangerous because it will bounce on the cutter head. I wouldn't dare joint this under any circumstances. I'd want to find another way to deal with that. If you have a drum sander, that might help you out. You may be down to double face taping this down and hitting it with a hand plane. That may be all you can do. Now, what about narrow material? This is thin material, but it's still fairly wide. I can joint the edge of this thin piece because it stands up high enough so that my hands, my fingers, are well above the cutter head of that jointer. But when it gets narrow like this, no way. And it's so thin, I don't have a good way to keep it against the fence, to keep it from flopping over, or to keep a grip on it without my hands slipping and possibly diving into the cutter head. So what do you do with small pieces, narrow pieces, things like that? I recommend seriously hand planes, and if you're not sure about them, or you don't feel that you can learn to use one? Yeah, you can. It's a skill. If you could learn to drive a car, you can learn to use these. Get yourself a block plane and buy good planes. Don't go to a big box store or one of the major importer people, if you know what I mean, and buy their stuff, because it's just junk. And it'll make you think that you're incompetent, and it's not you. It's the tool that's fighting you. Get a good block plane. Get yourself a good jack plane. A jack plane centers at a length of about 14 inches. This one is a Bailey number 5. I've had this thing for 44 years. Works great. If you can manage it, get yourself a jointer plane. This is also a Bailey. This is a number 7. It's a 22-inch jointer, and this one's real neat because it's got a corrugated sole. So these will help you with those small pieces of material. And if you put good irons in them, the standard irons are not as good, but if you buy a replacement iron that's thicker, these things will really do tremendous work, and they become a real pleasure to operate. So between these devices, and if you have to, hey, get out a belt sander. It's been done. So there's what you do with a jointer. Now, the question is, what about that opposite surface? I can't just joint the surface of a board and flip it over and joint the opposite surface, because if I do, those two surfaces will not be parallel. Remember I said earlier in the video, this is a jointer, it's not a planer. So what do? Well, that's not the subject of this video, but by way of introduction, this is what you do right here. This is a single surface planer, and this machine is intended to put a flat surface on that table. Its cutter head is suspended above the table, and the cutter head will cut a surface that will be flat and parallel to whatever is on the table. If you run warped lumber through, it's going to come out warped. That's why you have a jointer. You take the warp out of the surface of the lumber, you put it through the planer, and it brings the opposite surface parallel and to the exact thickness that you're after. That about covers the basics of using a jointer. I may do a video in the future that deals with dressing lumber altogether. In other words, bringing it to thickness, width, and length, and doing that in repeatable amounts or multiples, and even preparing to glue up wider panels like tabletops and that sort of thing. So I do hope this has been helpful. I am the Pragmatic Luthier, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars, and thanks again for watching. I hope you like this, and I hope you'll subscribe.